So before I tell you more about myself, and I think you just heard it all, I want to tell you more about Maryland, because you're probably thinking, Maryland, where in the heck is Maryland? We're a very small state located on the East Coast, and there's some quick facts about Maryland. 6 million people live in Maryland with me. The 18th most populated state, which make us very densely populated. The 5th most densely, 618 people per square mile. I put up there a reference for you of Iowa. You only have 55 people per square mile. If you think of Maryland, you might think of Baltimore. So here's some images you might think of. We have the Baltimore downtown inner harbor or inner city row housing. Probably not thinking of the Ravens or the Orioles too much because they haven't made the playoffs in quite some time. But you probably don't know that agriculture is still Maryland's #1 industry. We've had a lot of farm groups coming to Maryland in the past 5 or 6 years with interest on the water quality issues. And they are surprised to come to the eastern shore of Maryland, where my farm is located, and see scenes like that picture there, that we do have quite a bit of open farmland in the flat topography. Broilers are the #1 commodity in our state, followed by nursery and landscaping. Dairy is third, and then corn and soybeans, which are utilized to feed the broiler industry. When we talk about agriculture in Maryland, we usually generalize the region. The chicken industry is centered on the Delmarva Peninsula, so that includes Delaware and the 2 counties of Virginia that are on their eastern shore, as well as Maryland's eastern shore, which is 9 counties. So usually we talk about that combined. So on the Delmarva Peninsula, we raised almost 600 million birds last year, which used 85 million bushels of corn and 36 million bushels of soybeans for feed. This is what drives the grain industry in Maryland. If it weren't for the poultry, we probably wouldn't need to have so much grain. It does give us a good market, and we usually are about a positive 40-cent basis because of that. Here is a map of Maryland and commodities. Now, this is a little bit dated. You can see tobacco in the southern Maryland portion. We've had a tobacco buyout since this was printed, and that's pretty much been sold. There's not much of that left. And that's growing houses for the most part. That area between Baltimore and DC is very heavily populated. The chicken industry is primarily on the eastern shore, and it's very concentrated in that red circle there, the lower 4 counties of our state, as well as Delaware. A lot of the people in our area work for the federal government. I guess they're not working today because of the furlough, but we have a lot of bedroom communities between the Baltimore and Washington corridor. This is a picture of my home farm located in Kennedyville, Maryland, and you can see it is pretty wide open and rural. Again, we do have a 700 sow farrow to finish, and we are an independent grower. We market about 50% of our hogs as market hogs to Leidy's outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The rest we sell as feeder pigs to 2 other farmers to raise out. We supply a local butcher shop with all of the pork that they need, and we also sell research pigs to hospitals and various research groups. I chose this picture of our farm because at the top of the picture, where it past the trees, that is the Sassafras River, which is a tributary of the Chesapeake Bay. So that shows you we're not real far from a tributary. And if I went a couple more, if this picture was higher and you could go down to the bottom, there's another river that borders a few miles away to the south. I farm in partnership with my family. There's my mom and dad and my brother and my sister. And in the introduction, you heard that we started selling our own brand of pork, direct marketing under my family's last name. In 2005, we built we expanded. We doubled our herd from 350 to 700, and we built a large pen ESF gestation barn, and we have the Osborne feeders. That was in 2005, and at that time there were not very many feeders to look at. We had a choice between Shower and Osborne. While I would say we are early adopters on some things, our hand was somewhat forced on the issue of large pens. In 2003 and again in 2004, there were bills introduced into the Maryland legislature to outlaw or to ban gestation crates. We testified, my family and Maryland Farm Bureau and some other farm organizations testified against those bills, and we were able to they didn't come out of committee, so they never went to a full vote. If they had gotten out of committee in our state with very few farming people, there's no way that it wouldn't have passed. It would have passed if it came out of committee. So that's why we chose to go with large pen, or one of the main reasons we chose to do that. When we went to our local hearing in 2004 in our local county for zoning and permit hearing, there were about 8 people in the audience that we didn't know. I live in a very small town, and there's not a lot we know everybody. So it was unusual to have people at a zoning hearing that we did not know. They happened to be from HSUS headquarters in Washington, D.C., and they had signed up to testify against our building. When we started testifying, explaining how the operation was going to be a large pen system, they actually went to the back of the room where you sign in. They crossed their name off of the opposed and signed on to testify on our behalf, surprisingly enough. Of course, they said it was a great first step, and they'd like us to add some things like amenities and straw, things like that. But we did get our permit, and that building was built. So why am I here today? I'm here to talk about all of the water quality issues that we faced in the last few decades in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed. Now, when I was asked to do this, I decided that you probably wanted to hear some other opinions other than myself. So I did talk to some of the key players that have gone through more of the nitty-gritty as far as the development of the voluntary plans and the development of the mandatory plans. One of the people was our retired executive director from Maryland Pork Producers. Now, in a state like Maryland, it's not a lot of farming organizations, and we wouldn't have given her much salary. She couldn't have lived off of that. So she actually wore about 8 different hats. She also represented the Maryland Grain Producers, the Maryland Association of Soil Conservation Districts, as well as several others. And she was a paid lobbyist as well. I also talked to a neighbor of mine who was a former University of Maryland PhD student at the time of the development of the phosphorus management tool, and she actually worked on developing that. And I also talked to Hans Schmidt, who is an assistant secretary at the Maryland Department of Agriculture and Research Conservation. So I've kind of borrowed slides from a lot of different people to give you a better perspective. A lot of people in Maryland, all those 6 million friends of mine that live there with me, really enjoy doing things on the bay. So it is a source of recreation. You have sailing and boating. People are very interested in crabbing and fishing, and as well there's the commercial rock fishing and crabbing and oyster industries that also use the Chesapeake Bay. So it's not a hard sell to ask people, do you want to save the bay? Of course, everyone wants to save the bay. Farmers want to save the bay. We want to have good water quality. There is actually a license plate that's available for sale in our state for $20. You can have the Save the Bay license plate, and that money goes to help restore the bay. So I think I need to give you a little bit of description of the bay. It is a very large watershed, so it's a large land mass to small water ratio. 64,000 square miles encompassing parts of 6 different states. 18 million people live in the watershed, but if you ask people why the water quality is bad in the Chesapeake Bay, the first answer is always the farmers. So the Chesapeake Bay is an estuary, and that means it's a combination of saltwater and freshwater. So it is tidal. The water, half of the water in the Chesapeake Bay flows in from the Atlantic Ocean, which would be down here where the inlet is, and makes it this way. I live up toward the northern part, so it's more freshwater up here. And then 50% of the water comes in from freshwater tributaries. The largest of those is the Susquehanna, which provides 50% of the fresh water. So that's the large blue area there that goes through Pennsylvania and New York. Since people in Pennsylvania and New York don't live very close to the Chesapeake Bay, at least not as close as we do, I think farmers in particular, or people in general, don't feel as tied to the Chesapeake Bay as people in our state. So it's been harder sell in their states to get people to try new things to save the bay. And then when you add the, let's see, this red watershed, which is the Potomac, that's the river that goes through Washington, D.C., and then the dark red one of the Patuxent, that adds another 30% of the freshwater flow. So now you have 80% of the flow from 3 of those watersheds. That only leaves 20% of the freshwater coming from all of these, and there's minor ones all along the shore here that weren't even given a color. So that's technically only 10% of the water in the Chesapeake Bay comes from all of those other sources. And I point all that out to you because remember, the poultry industry is just tucked in over here, but that is the reason that our bay has poor water quality. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history about how we got to where we are today from where we started. In the early 1980s, we had some simple agreements that were signed by the governors of a couple states. So the EPA, the governors of Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, along with the mayor of, those were governors, and the mayor of the District of Columbia, signed a pledge that said, we are going to restore the bay. About the only thing that the bill really did was establish the EPA Chesapeake Program Office, which is the U.S. EPA, and they have kept track of data and things like that. But the pledge said nothing more than we want to restore the bay. There were no numbers, no dates, no nothing. So it really didn't do a whole lot. In 1987, they signed the next agreement, and that was a 40% reduction. So they actually had put some numbers in that one in the year 2000. So that gave us 13 years to get to that. But there was no interim goals. So when we got to 2000, nothing really had happened. In another agreement in 2000, the rest of the watershed states signed into the next agreement. And in those early years, starting in 1989, farmers in Maryland had voluntary nutrient management plans. And they were fairly, what we would think of as simple today, that you needed to match your inputs with the crops that you wanted to grow. So they had soil test, manure testing, and then field-specific recommendations, and it was all nitrogen-based. No one had really thought that phosphorus was a problem at that time. Everything changed in 1997 with what we call the Fusteria Hysteria. So in August of 1997, there was a fish kill in a river that was located in poultry country, the Pocomoke River. They were menhaden fish, which are small, like feeder fish, and they were found with these Fusteria lesions. If you looked at the newspaper, you thought it was hundreds of thousands of fish that had died, and in all reality, DNR says it was 3,000 to 11,000 fish, and it was probably no more than a pickup, no more than a filling up the back of a pickup. But you can see examples of the articles that were in the newspaper at the time. So people were claiming to be becoming sick, and it didn't take many days for all the blame to be placed. Manure from chicken farms suspected to be the cause of the ill people and the fish kill. So there was a lot of pressure to do something. The governor at the time, Governor Glenn Tenning, was a Democrat who had run on an environmental platform. And he wanted the Chesapeake Bay cleaned up, and something was going to happen. There was a loose committee of people that had worked on developing the voluntary nutrient management plans, and they were basically part of this legislative task force. So the governor said he was going to come up with a bill in that session in 1998 to fix the water quality. These people, the stakeholders in this legislative task force felt a lot of pressure to do something. And you can see it was a lot of representation from farmers, also Chesapeake Bay Foundation, that would be the environmental group. And they introduced the bill for the Water Quality Improvement Act of 1998. Farmers, individual farmers, not maybe leadership in these groups, were very angry. They felt that the leadership of Farm Bureau and the leadership of the grain producers and the leadership of the Delmarva poultry industry had caved. But I think from talking to the people that were actually in these meetings, they felt that there was going to be a horrible bill that came our way if they didn't come up with something. And they would prefer to have something that mirrored our voluntary program than something that non-farmers had written for us. So this made nutrient management plans mandatory for pretty much everyone, and it included nitrogen and phosphorus. It's great to pass bills like this, but actually we had no science. We had no recommendations at that time for reductions in phosphorus. So it took some time to let science catch up with policy. There had been some research starting in 1994 thinking about the possibility of loss of soluble phosphorus in groundwater. But it took a couple years to get the phosphorus site index published. That came out in 2000. And then we spent about a couple more years. They were introducing that to farmers, and it took 5 years in total before that became mandatory. And again, I would say this was a very ugly period in time for farmers. There were hearings where the University of Maryland researchers would explain the soil science, and most of the time the farmers, especially ones in high phosphorus areas, would just, they were mad, they were angry, they were screaming, yelling, arguing that should not have been developed and that we should go back to voluntary plans. Well, that wasn't going to happen. So the relationship between farmers and extension and farmers and University of Maryland just became very, very strained at the time. And then to add some insult to injury, the Waterkeepers Alliance came into town. In November of 2007, the Waterkeepers Alliance held they called it the Eastern Shore Poultry Summit. They held it in Ocean City, in the heart of chicken country. Robert Kennedy and the Attorney General of Maryland, Doug Gansler, were the keynote speakers. And our Attorney General, in his speech, said, and I'm quoting, that we should ramp up enforcement of the poultry industry by government and citizens through the Clean Water Act. He also said that it was absurd that the nutrient management plans were not public documents, despite the fact that they were protected in the Maryland statute that created them. Also at the summit, the University of Maryland, and University of Maryland is our land-grant university. So the University of Maryland Law Clinic director explained to the citizens in attendance at this summit how to go after farmers using the Clean Water Act. Well, it didn't take long. 2 years later, in November of 2009, the Waterkeepers Alliance, the Assateague Coastal Keepers in particular, were hiring planes to take aerial photos of chicken litter piles on the eastern shore. And they came up with some that they felt were illegal. And they filed a notice of intent to sue. That was their first response. They didn't talk to the Maryland Department of Environment. They didn't talk to the Maryland Department of Agriculture. They took a picture of a pile and filed a notice of intent to sue. In a short time after that, Maryland Department of the Environment went to inspect the pile and found that it was not chicken litter. It was biosolids from the town of Ocean City. And while it was placed too close to a ditch and on the lower shore with the water table as high as it is, we do have a lot of ditches, so it's hard to cite them far from a ditch. But anyway, he was asked to move the pile, which he did, and he was fined $4,000 for having it improperly sited. And I think that was in hopes to placate Waterkeepers Alliance so that that would end. But it didn't. They decided to file a suit anyway. And they have been quoted in seminars since then on how you can win a lawsuit even if you don't win in court. You make the farmer file bankruptcy. So they would just drag it out and pile up legal fees on the farmer and cause a big mess. So this was a farmer that grew for Purdue, so they had filed a suit against the Hudson family and Purdue Incorporated. It drug out until 2012, and the judge did rule in favor of the farmer. He did not award the farmer any money and not even court costs. They did try to get the court costs back from the Waterkeepers Alliance. Fortunately, there was a large community support and effort to go on that we raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for this farm family to help them with their legal fees. It was called SaveFarmFamilies.org. And I will have to say that there was local support from farm bureaus, there was regional support from other poultry growers, poultry companies, but we even had national support. There was a lot of money that came in from across the country to help this particular farmer. As a result of this lawsuit, the Maryland Department of Agriculture did come out with a series of public service ads. This is one of them talking about poultry litter, but I think the entire series of ads was called Manure Happens. So they're trying to educate the public on things that happen on the farm and best management practices. But change wasn't happening fast enough for everybody. So in 2009, not long after President Obama was elected, he signed the presidential executive order which declared that the Chesapeake Bay was a national treasure, and it authorized the U.S. EPA to establish a TMDL for the Chesapeake Bay. And it basically puts EPA in charge of the cleanup and not the states. Let's see, a TMDL, we just kind of went over that. So, but it did include all of the states. So in years past, maybe each state wasn't giving as much commitment as some other states. So this does incorporate all of the Bay states into the plan. So a TMDL is a total maximum daily load. So basically, it's a pollution diet. It gives an amount of pollution that is allowed to be put into a body of water, and that it would still be able to remain healthy at that level. And the Federal Clean Water Act requires that we do a TMDL for or requires that for waters that don't meet state standards. So you may wonder where do they get these numbers from and what do they do with them? There is actually a Chesapeake Bay Model, and that's administered by the Chesapeake Bay program. So this is a simulated model using data collected from 1985. So it uses a model number to determine the load. And then those numbers are broken down. So you have a number for the whole bay, and then you break that down into every watershed, and then it breaks down into every smaller watershed behind that. There are, especially in farmers' opinions, there are limits to the use of a model because it uses assumptions and generalizations. We've spent a lot of time in our state working with the collection of the data so that it is correct. They were using, for instance, they were using yields on crops that were very old. So if you don't have a high enough yield on the crop, it's not pulling enough of the nutrients out of the ground. So in the model, it's not doing all that correctly. And the scary thing is that policy gets made from these models, whether they're right or they're wrong. Each time that we come to a major milestone, the model does get to be recalibrated. But in the time in between, they don't make any changes. So for a point source, like a pipe coming from a wastewater treatment plant, it kind of makes sense where look at the number. They know what the water quality is of the water coming out of the wastewater treatment plant. They could calculate exactly how many pounds of nitrogen and phosphorus are coming from each water plant. Add that all together. How do you get the numbers from non-point sources, which is what farmers are, with runoffs from fields and things like that? So these are the kinds of things that go in on the ag sector into the model. So there are numbers for how much nutrients are going to be reduced because of each one of these things, because of nutrient management, because of precision agriculture, because of conservation tillage and cover crops. So it's hard enough to track how many acres are covered by each one of the things, let alone come up with a number of how each one of these things is going to affect water quality. 2017 is going to be, or 2017 was a milestone for us in the water quality. So right now they're crunching the numbers and comparing the actual water quality to the model, and then there will be a recalibration. And we are hoping that they did a good job in the past and there's not a huge recalibration. We hope that the reductions that we have seen in the model are actually happening. The ones in the gray box are interim BMPs that say in their tracks. So these were things that came along since the last time they recalibrated. So these things were being tracked, but not until the recalibration will these be put in. Let's see. Every year, every 10 years, the BMPs need to be recertified. So let's say there's so many feet of grass waterway on my farm. They don't get to count in this program unless it's recertified every 10 years. It's there, but they need to come. It's usually soil conservation who comes out and has to recertify those things. The other interesting thing that we have had to work on in this particular area is the numbers for, let's say, field buffers. Those or mortality composters, they would only get the numbers from things that had been paid through cost share because they could go and find the numbers there. So there's actually been a push and a method developed to track things that farmers had paid for themselves. So I know on our farm, you might get to the end of the lifetime of a grass waterway and the cost share is so much for soil conservation to come in and redesign it, or we think maybe we can do it cheaper than that, so we'll do it without the cost share money. So the things that were done without cost share money are really, really, really hard to track. So our nutrient management plan, regulations today look like this. I'm not going to read all these to you. A couple of the ones that we think might have a little bit of tweaking necessary would be the yield history used to set the yield goal. If you actually only use your history, so you take a 5-year average, and typically in Maryland we do a 2-year rotation of 3 crops. So we usually do small grains followed by double crop soybeans followed by corn the next year. So we wouldn't have an average for every crop every year. But if you're only allowed to use your actual yield history to calculate your yield goal, it doesn't ever allow you to go up. It only allows you to go down. So fortunately, the people the auditors or the people that review the nutrient management plans don't really make you prove the 3-year average. As long as your yield goal is reasonable, and in our area, 225 bushels of corn on dry land or 240 for irrigated is probably what we do. If you're not terribly outside of those numbers, they're not really going to say anything. I'm sure if you wrote a plan that said you were going to get 400 bushel corn, then they'd have something to say about that. The other thing would be the incorporation of manure within 48 hours. So Maryland has been a long-time supporter of no-till. No-till was used in Maryland starting in the late 1970s. And now that all the chicken litter needs to be incorporated, we're doing more tillage now than we used to. We're doing a minimum till on this. Usually people are using a turbo till or some form of vertical tillage. But I think farmers are kind of waiting to see how the research is going to pan out on this, because they're thinking there might be, they didn't want the manure, the researchers and the regulators didn't want the manure laying on top of on the soil, because they're afraid that the rain's hitting it and washing it across the top of the soil. And farmers are wondering, is it good to till the top couple inches? Are we losing more soil that way, and therefore more phosphorus attached to the soil? So this one has been something that's changed in thinking over time. And then the dates. We cannot apply any nutrients, commercial or manure, between December 16th and February the 28th. Now this number seems to be highly political. Every time there's a new change of administration, the dates change, as if farmers farm by a calendar. There have been 2 years in the past 3 that have been very mild in the winter, and small grains have greened up before March 1st. So both of those years there was a waiver issued by the Secretary of Agriculture in our state to allow for the spreading of nutrients on small grains before March 1st. So like I said, this date has been changed. We had the prior administration, that was a Democratic administration, wanted to move it back to November 1st. My mother happened to be the president of Maryland Farm Bureau at this time and was sitting in one of the nutrient management meetings with the Governor's Bay cabinet. So that would have been the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of the Department of Natural Resources, and the Secretary of the Environment. There were environmental groups there as well as some other farm organizations, and they were debating these dates. Where should these dates be? And the environmentalists think we shouldn't be, they want to cut it off early in the fall. And my mother made the comment, well, for all the farms that have manure storage, let's say a hog farm with a lagoon, or with a deep pit, or dairy farms, and we have more dairy farms than we have hog farms, their storage has been built, not just on a whim, but according to NRCS standards. But NRCS standards allow for the spreading of manure twice a year, in the spring and then again in the fall. And the environmentalist was sitting across from her, said, well, we're not trying to limit you spreading it twice a year. You have all spring and all summer. And and my mom just sat there for a little while, and it took the Secretary of Agriculture to explain to this lady that you can't spread manure on top of corn when it's growing. So that just goes to show you, the lack of knowledge of some of the people that you're dealing with on these issues. These are some more details of our current nutrient management regulations. So we have setbacks from streams. There's really nothing that you can do within 10 feet of a stream. They did require one of those unintended consequences, I guess, because the people that were introducing these bills way back when, they were going after big chicken. Well, when streams needed to be fenced off from livestock, it actually, came back on some dairy farmers and beef farmers because no one had fenced out the streams. And then you can see that there's pretty much a 35 feet buffer around streams and around field edges as well. The phosphorus management tool is just coming on board. It's being phased in right now. So this is like the second generation of the phosphorus management in our state. We had the phosphorus site index. So this is I don't exactly know how this is going to affect our farm. It's just being calculated at this point in time. We're going to have 3 years to base it. Now, we know that on our farm, we don't have many fields that are in the high, or on this chart, even on the low. We have a few fields that are in the 160 FIV, which is the fertility indexed value. So we don't exactly know, we haven't seen all the ramifications of that on our farm. But up until now, because we're not in a high phosphorus area, we haven't had any restrictions on our farm. In fact, we've probably been able to spread more poultry litter than we have in the past because people on the lower shore haven't been able to use it, so we actually were able to find some that we could purchase. So we've been using more poultry litter than we have in the past. with the actual soil test data that the Maryland Department of Agriculture has collected, they know that there's only about 20% of the high, low to medium high. So anything affected by PMT is only 20% of the soil in our state, which is a lot less than we were projecting years ago. These are some borrowed slides, as you can see from the Maryland Department of Agriculture, and I cannot explain all of the numbers, but I did want you to look at the line that's in red for agriculture. So that is how much, on the top line, it is how much nitrogen has been attributed to agriculture going into the bay since 1985, and you can see that we've had progress. We are projected to meet our 2007, as far as we know, if all the numbers plan out right, agriculture in Maryland met its goals for nitrogen and phosphorus. That's not true of Pennsylvania and New York. So we can't say agriculture in general has met its goals because not all of the states did. We're worried, as farmers, we're worried about the next phase. So we'll be in the watershed improvement program in the third phase starting in 2018. So you can see that whoops, oh, that was the wrong button. There we go. Wait a minute. Okay, so you can see we had a great reduction, but we've been holding stable at that 19, 18, 17 number for about 8 or 9 years. So we are concerned about the next step. How are we going to get to the 2025 goal? So what do we have coming up next? We're going to have to reevaluate things that we're already doing, and we're going to have to continue to do everything that we're doing up to this date. One of the things that they're talking about is nutrient trading, and I think farmers really don't know where to stand on that issue. Oh, I have another one. We'll talk about that on the next slide. But we're not sure what we're going to be asked to do in the next phase. So do we want to trade away any of credits that we might have in excess right now, or do we want to wait until we have to have those in our back pocket for when we're asked to do more? So what are farmers doing right now? Cover crop is probably one of our best management practices and one of the most effective ones. We're planting over 500,000 acres of cover crop, and that does not include small grains for harvest. To put that in perspective, we have 1.3 million acres of cropland, so more than half of our land is planted in small grains over the winter. And then we had all these acres covered by plans and grass buffers were put in. And probably the other big one is transported 213,000 tons of manure out of the lower shore into other areas. Again, the cover crop program is very important, and this is why farmers are planting 500,000 acres. We get paid to plant those somewhere between $45 and $75 an acre, and then they are not harvested. You can see there's different incentives or bonuses based on different types of cover crops that you would put in, but the biggest ones are based on the date that you get it planted in. We do a lot of aerial planting of cover crops, so we can fly it on over top of standing corn, and then it's up and growing by the time we harvest the corn. And most of that is timing. We just don't have time to get everything done. If we waited until we harvest it, we'd be past these dates. And then again, the next most important probably is the manure transport program. So that is also a cost share, and farmers are paid up to $20 a ton to move manure out of the lower shore up into areas of the state where there is less phosphorus. And they have a new program out this year called Fast Track, because farmers had complained that the program took too many days. So it's a simplified process that they get their answer in 48 hours. And actually, as a farmer on the upper shore, we benefit from this program because we are receivers of manure. Where does this money come from to pay for these things? So in 2004, there was the Bay Restoration Fund. The general public mostly called this the flush tax. So $5 a year was added to everybody's water bill that was on a wastewater treatment plant. And that money is specifically earmarked to upgrade wastewater treatment plants. And then anybody that's on a private septic was assessed $60 on their property tax bill, and 40% of that money goes toward the cover crop program. In addition, there's a Chesapeake Bay Trust Fund, which is money that's coming straight out of the general budget. So the General Assembly is adding this every year. It hasn't been fully funded every year, but they have almost fully funded it pretty much every year. So that's how they can afford to put $20 million into a program to pay farmers to plant cover crops. Again, this is a borrowed slide, so I'm not going to explain, I don't think I could explain everything, but this is why agriculture will be continued to ask to do more than their fair share. Where I have the arrows, you see that is the cost per pound of, the top one is the cost per pound of nitrogen that was reduced from the agriculture sector. And it is the cheapest cost. And then even in phosphorus, it's the cheapest. So and this is where the nutrient trading comes into play. So a wastewater treatment plant that's looking to reduce phosphorus is going to look to agriculture because they can reduce a pound for a lot less money than they can. What kind of resources do farmers get to help with nutrient management plans? There are certified nutrient management consultants. Most of them are somebody that you hired, so you pay them. There is cost share money available to pay for that consultant. And then each county in Maryland has a nutrient management specialist, and they will help farmers write a plan for no fee. They usually are very backlogged. So as far as compliance, 98% of our farmers are covered by a nutrient management plan. And for the few that aren't, they have started getting fines for that. For many years, they had the threat of the fines in the statute, but they didn't really assess them until recently. And then when farmers their plans are audited, 61% are in compliance, and then another 25% of those just haven't had their new plan rewritten. So they probably have a plan, it just doesn't have the correct dates. Every year, we do not have to give the nutrient management plan to the Maryland Department of Agriculture, but we do need to fill out an annual report. And over time, this has changed. When I was speaking to the former executive director of Maryland swine producers and of the grain producers, and she was in this planning process, she said in the early years after voluntary nutrient management plan, we know farmers had done things and we know they had made progress, but there was no record of that. There was no centralized collection of the data for them to take to the administration when they were complaining about farmers don't do anything to say, but we've reduced nitrogen by X number. We didn't have any of that data. We could say, yes, we know farmers are reducing nitrogen, but without the proof and without the numbers to back it up, it's nothing. Now, on my farm, we divide the jobs between everybody. I run the farrowing house and gestation barn. My sister runs the finisher barn, and my brother's primary cropping and repairman. He loves that one, especially when I call. He says, "What did you break now?" So, but I do fill out the nutrient management forms to help him. So I am familiar with these numbers. And the way that we've supplied information to the Maryland Department of Agriculture has changed over time. This one always seems weird to us as farmers because we report in pounds, total pounds. They say, how many total pounds of nitrogen did you use? So we'll have something like 1,000, I'm using 1,000 but because I can calculate quick, but we'll have 1,000 acres of corn and it used 240,000 pounds of nitrogen were applied, and that sounds like a terrible number. When we were talking earlier about keeping these private, when the Waterkeeper Alliance was suing to get these made public, farmers were very worried that these numbers were going to be used against them, mostly because people would think that they looked like really big numbers. They wouldn't divide by acres to get a certain number of pounds per acre, and they would say, oh my goodness, this farm's spreading 500,000 pounds of nitrogen. So that was one of the reasons that we felt back then that things should be kept protected and confidential. In hindsight, that probably was a battle that we didn't need to fight because a lot of the farms, especially manure generating farms, are now under a CAFO regulation. And before all this hoopla about poultry, my farm was one of 8 CAFOs in the state of Maryland. In fact, we had the EPA come to our farm, a neighboring dairy farm, and a neighboring poultry farm who were all CAFOs in one county, and they did mock EPA training because we're so close to DC. What a great, great way to spend your time. But now I've lost my train of thought. Sorry. It's important to have numbers that make sense, that are easily collected and easily compared over all the different crops. It's okay for corn and beans, but then you start adding in the vegetable crops, and those things, they got pretty strange. Oh, but we were talking about the CAFO. So when we submit our reports, this report also, since we're a CAFO, needs to go to the Maryland Department of Environment. The statute does not protect our report in the Maryland Department of the Environment. So we fought the big battle to make sure everything was private, and now we have to report to MDE anyway, so it doesn't matter. When all this was going on, they changed the CAFO requirements in our state. They made a MAFO, a Maryland Animal Feeding Operation, because the threshold wasn't met by most poultry farmers. They didn't meet the reporting requirement because they were too small. So what Maryland did is they just ratcheted the number way down to pretty much catch everybody. So now most all poultry farms, regardless of size, are now called a MAFO. So I was asked to give you my advice, and again, this is a lot of different people giving advice with me. Maintain the relationships with the environmental groups, with researchers. I was talking to you earlier about the ugly period when we were just mad at everyone. We didn't talk nice with anybody at that time. We fought and cried for a long time after mandatory programs came into effect and said, we don't want to do mandatory, let's go back to voluntary. And we spent a lot of energy and time doing that. Create a voluntary nutrient management framework now. Farmers are the ones that need to be creating this, so you know how it's going to work. You don't want an environmental group creating nutrient management plan for you. At least come up with a framework that's workable so that when someone comes knocking and says these now need to be mandatory, you have something to offer and you don't have to do it in one year. And we've talked about already collecting data on your progress. You need to have proof that things are going in the right direction. Soil test data. In the early years when the mandatory was first becoming, like back in 85 when that was first becoming, no, not 85. But anyway, when mandatory first came on board, some farmers were saying, why don't we just give them our soil test data and say, well, our soils aren't high in phosphorus, and why don't we just do it that way? In looking at 30 years of data on our farm, phosphorus, even though we've been changing the way we operate, it hasn't really moved in 30 years. So the other side of that is the farmers that were in high phosphorus areas, they weren't too keen on giving up their soil test data that early. And then the way that things have happened in our state, the way that things have gotten done is to incentivize the action. You need to offer farmers money to do something through cost share. The bottom slide there is just something that has evolved over time in our annual report. So these are things that Maryland Department of Agriculture thinks are important to track so that they can have some data, some things to say, look, these are good things that we are doing in our state. So I think that's about all the advice that I can give on what we've done and a history of what has happened in Maryland. I know it's kind of a boring topic, and I'm sorry. But if you have any questions, I'd be willing to answer them, and I will be here for a while if you want to stick around and ask me something afterwards. Yes?
Thank you. It's an excellent presentation. You talked about TMDLs there for a while from EPA and how difficult it is to calculate a number for a non-point source. What's the status of that? Where has EPA gone in terms of trying to allocate or assign a number to non-point source? And now has this administration backed off of that any, or what's the status today?
I don't think we've noticed any difference with this administration. I know there's been a softening of the talk I guess, coming from the EPA director in our area. But as far as I know, the Chesapeake Bay program is going forward. And it all boils down to 2017 was a milestone. We will not know anything. And they are doing the numbers right now. Until we see how the model numbers compare to the milestone number, like what goals were or what the actual water quality was, we won't really know what changes.
Will they be able, from that model, they won't be able to assign a number to your farm? So
they haven't gotten down to that. They haven't gotten down to that level. They are to the small tributary level, though. So a small stream that's somewhat intermittent outside of our farm, they can get a number to that.
So if that small stream is high, will that have a practical implication? Will some...
Well, that can be a fear.
come on your farm?
We haven't seen that yet. Yes.
Like your application for crops, like what you apply the manure and how you plant crops?
We would apply the manure before we plant the cover crop in the fall. So we don't spread all of our. We handle our cover crops a little bit. Not all of them are handled exactly the same. So there are some fields on our home farm near the finisher, and we do empty our lagoon annually of the sludge. So in that field, we actually hire that job done because we used to be able to do it ourselves, and we can't do it we can't get it done in the right time frame anymore. And there is money to incentivize the injection of manure. So we utilize a service that injects with a drag line, and we can collect the cost share on that. So we can practically pay for him to do it. So it works out well. So we would spread that in early fall and then work it in and plant the cover crop right behind.
And do you start fertilizer, nitrate, you add some commercial on top of that? How do you do this first?
In the spring? On the cover crop?
No, on corn crop.
Yes. We would, typically, we would put some down with a starter fertilizer. I made my brother write this down for me. It's on my last piece of paper. So we typically spread some or put some in with the planter, a starter, and then we would spread a commercial fertilizer around within the same few days, and then we side dress after that. And we can utilize a pre-side dress nitrate test if we think we need to increase that amount, but typically we don't do that on our farm. And then in the fall, if we want to apply fertilizer, I guess that has been a change for us. In the fall, if we want to apply fertilizer to a small grain crop for harvest, we need to do the fall nitrate test on that. Does that answer your question? Good, because I'm not the crop person at my farm. Yes?
Does anybody check up on residential runoff?
Actually, yes and no. There is a law that the lawn care companies, so if you wanted to hire those trucks that come out and spread fertilizer, and in the nicer suburbs of Maryland, there's a lot of people to use that. Those people need to be certified, and they actually have to follow a lawn care nutrient management plan. But the percentage that affects the bay, I mean, farmers think it's a lot, but it's really quite small.
Have you had any increased attention towards regulating air quality?
Yes, there's a hearing on that in our state today. I got an email yesterday from my executive director of Maryland Pork Producers, and there's a bill, I think today, that they were having a hearing, because she was saying, well, you don't have to come tomorrow. And I said, well, thank goodness, because you had already committed me to Iowa. So yes, they were looking at forming a committee between two non-ag groups that was going to come up with some numbers to regulate air quality. Our testimony was pretty much centering on maybe some ag people with some ag background need to be included. But it was it was Johns Hopkins Bloomberg group, and I can't remember some public health group that's who they wanted to pull from for the committee. We've also had an antibiotic bill last year that passed, that they don't want us to use any preventative treatment. Yes?
You mentioned early on the
conflict with the Delmarva Poultry people. Has that shifted over time to be more collaborative since they...
Oh, that farmers were angry with every organization that they were in. That was the conflict. Yes. It was just in the very beginning. Farmers, if they weren't involved high up in the organization to be attending some of these meetings, they were just angry. They were angry at Farm Bureau. People dropped memberships, but that has since subsided.
And those relationships going across some of those on the list there?
Environmental groups. Oh yes, I did want to mention that. Not all waterkeeper alliances are created equally. In my county, there's two waterkeepers: the Chester River Waterkeepers and the Sassafras River Waterkeepers. The Chester River actually hired a fellow who retired from soil conservation, and so he has a great rapport with all the farmers, and they actually do cost share. They bought a green seeker. If I say green seeker, do you know what that is? Okay. So the waterkeepers in our watershed bought a green seeker that farmers could rent. That way each farmer didn't have it. So that is something that spreads nitrogen at a variable rate, and it does so by looking at the color of the crop. So it looks at the greenness of the corn as it's going across and changes the nitrogen as it's going across the field. So not all waterkeepers are created equal, and yes, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation also, that group and farmers have come to better terms as well. There was actually a joke for a while that our Farm Bureau president, not my mom, it was a man, that they would say that he said in a speech that he was courting the director of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and then she came to our meeting and she said they were up to dating. So that's been better, but I think everybody still is cautious about those in particular.
Okay. One last question.
How would you say agriculture is currently perceived now by the general public?
In Maryland, they don't know a lot about agriculture still. And I would still say there is the big chicken. I mean, they still think big chicken is doing, I mean, just today with the hearing on air emissions, that is definitely focused toward the chicken industry. I don't think they ever get that how big of a factor it is in our economy. I don't think they'll ever see that. Not in Maryland. The people are very, very liberal. And most of them in the central part of Maryland also are pretty well off, so they don't have to think about where their food comes or how much they have to pay for food. Yes?
Are any crews testing nitrate pipelines like on their own farm? I know our Iowa Soybean Association has done just a really good job helping farmers test water management pipelines. And we see that like nitrogen fertilizer rates don't make as much of an impact on loss. It's actually lack of food. So our residential more important. And we only have someone like crews taking pipelines.
We have a very high water table, so we don't tile in our state.
Or any non-point ability test?
Yes, there are some organizations that there's several that do testing. There's some that are doing testing of runoff through waterways. That's how we would collect water coming out of the field. So yes, there are research groups doing that. And I guess that's another one of those things when I say look at the relationships, because I know Maryland Grain Producers with their funding does fund research through our state. So it would be for things like that would be important to do.